The rushing water swept over the banks of the Colorado River with a vengeance, and Josephine Zimmerman knew in that moment she had made a terrible mistake. Her arms ached, her lungs burned, and the tiny bundle she clutched to her chest was the only thing keeping her from surrendering to the powerful current that threatened to drag them both to a watery grave. It was April 1878, and the spring melt had transformed the normally placid river near Castle Dome, Arizona Territory, into a raging torrent. Josephine had been desperate to wash the baby's clothes. Little Benjamin was only 3 months old and had soiled his last clean gown. She'd thought the shallow inlet would be safe, even with the river running high. She'd been wrong. One misstep on the slippery bank was all it took. Now she was being pulled downstream, her sodden skirts weighing her down, her strength fading with each passing second. She managed to keep Benjamin's face above water, but her own head slipped beneath the surface again and again as she fought to stay afloat. "Help!" she screamed whenever she managed to break the surface, but her voice was lost in the roar of the water. The baby wailed, his cries piercing her heart. She had already lost her husband to typhoid fever just weeks after Benjamin's birth. She couldn't bear the thought of her baby being orphaned or worse. Jackson Turner had been riding the boundaries of what he hoped would soon be his ranch when he heard something strange carrying on the wind. He reined in his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chief, and cocked his head to listen. There it was again, a cry, almost like a child but different somehow, more desperate. He urged Chief toward the sound, following it to the riverbank where the Colorado was running fast and angry. And then he saw her, a woman struggling in the water. Something clutched to her chest, her long dark hair plastered to her face as she fought the current. Without hesitation, Jackson kicked free of his stirrups and spurred Chief into a gallop along the bank, keeping pace with the woman as she was swept downstream. He searched frantically for a spot where the river narrowed, where he might have a chance of reaching her. "Hold on," he shouted, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm coming." Josephine was losing hope. Her muscles screamed with fatigue, and Benjamin's cries were growing weaker. She'd managed to keep his head above water, but both of them were drenched and the spring air was cool. Even if they survived the river, the cold might claim them. Then, through water-blurred eyes, she saw a rider on the bank, keeping pace with them. A flicker of hope ignited in her chest. "Help us," she cried, summoning her remaining strength. "My baby." Jackson spotted a bend in the river ahead where the current pushed toward the bank before sweeping around a curve. It was his best chance. He dismounted in one fluid motion, secured Chief's reins to a sturdy cottonwood, and stripped off his heavy leather vest and gun belt. Keeping his boots on for traction, he waded into the shallows, bracing himself against the pull of the water. "Head toward me," he shouted to the woman, gesturing with his arms. "Try to angle this way." Josephine saw what the stranger was attempting and kicked with her legs, trying to propel herself toward the bank. The current fought her, but she managed to make incremental progress. The man was wading deeper now, the water at his waist, then his chest. She feared he too would be swept away. As she approached the bend, the current suddenly accelerated, pushing her toward the waiting cowboy. Their fingers brushed, missed, then connected. His grip was iron, and he pulled her toward him with surprising strength, anchoring himself with his other hand on a partially submerged tree trunk. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady and reassuring as he wrapped a strong arm around her waist. "I've got both of you." Together they fought the current, inching toward the shore. When they finally reached shallow water, Josephine's legs gave out entirely. The cowboy scooped her up, baby and all, and carried them the rest of the way to dry land. He set her down gently on the grass beneath a cottonwood tree. "Is the baby breathing?" he asked urgently. Josephine looked down at Benjamin, who was coughing up river water but still crying the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "Yes," she managed through chattering teeth. "Yes, he's alive." Relief flooded the cowboy's face. He quickly retrieved a blanket from his saddle and wrapped it around Josephine and the baby. "My name's Jackson Turner," he said. "What's yours, madam?" "Josephine Zimmerman," she replied, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "And this is my son, Benjamin." Jackson nodded. "You're both mighty cold, Mrs. Zimmerman. My camp's not far. We need to get you warm and dry before nightfall." Josephine hesitated only briefly before nodding her agreement. She had no choice but to trust this stranger who had just saved their lives. As he helped her to her feet, she swayed, still unsteady. "Easy now," Jackson said, his voice gentle. He whistled for his horse, who trotted obediently to his side. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Josephine said, though in truth she wasn't certain her trembling limbs would support her. Jackson seemed to read her doubt. "I'll ride with you," he decided, helping her mount before swinging up behind her. He arranged the blanket to cover all three of them, then urged Chief forward at a careful walk. "Hold onto the baby tight. We'll have you warm soon." Josephine leaned back slightly against his solid chest, too exhausted to worry about propriety. Benjamin had quieted, his tiny body shivering against hers. She closed her eyes briefly, overcome with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved our lives." "Anyone would have done the same," Jackson replied, his voice rumbling in his chest. But Josephine knew better. They had been alone in Castle Dome since Thomas died, with few friends and no family. If this man hadn't happened by at that exact moment, she and Benjamin would surely have drowned. Jackson's camp was indeed nearby, a small but tidy setup near a stand of cottonwoods that offered shelter from the wind. A canvas tent was pitched beside a small fire ring, and a second horse, a gray mare, was picketed nearby. He helped Josephine dismount, still cradling Benjamin. "The tent's all yours, madam. I'll build up the fire so you can get warm. There's a spare shirt of mine in my bedroll you can use while your clothes dry." Josephine nodded gratefully and ducked inside the tent. It was sparsely furnished but clean, with a bedroll laid out neatly on one side. She quickly stripped off her sodden dress and petticoats, wrapping Benjamin and herself in the dry blanket while she searched for the promised shirt. She found it tucked into the bedroll, a faded blue flannel that smelled of soap and sunshine. She pulled it on, the sleeves hanging well past her hands, the hem falling to mid-thigh. It wasn't proper, but it was dry and warm. She used a corner of the blanket to gently dry Benjamin, who fussed at the handling but seemed otherwise unharmed by their ordeal. When they emerged from the tent, Jackson had a cheerful fire blazing and a pot of coffee brewing. He'd hung her sodden garments on a makeshift line strung between two trees. He glanced up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral despite her unusual attire. "Coffee's almost ready," he said. "And I've got some jerky and hardtack. Not much of a meal, I'm afraid." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, settling on a log near the fire. Benjamin had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted by his ordeal. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Turner." "Jackson, please," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "And no thanks needed." She studied him as she accepted the cup. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of the Arizona sky. Dark hair curled slightly from beneath his hat, and a short beard covered his jaw. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. "What brings you to this part of the territory?" she asked, sipping the strong, hot coffee gratefully. "Looking to buy land," he replied, settling on a stump across from her. "I've saved up from 10 years of driving cattle, and I'm ready to have a spread of my own. This area has good water and decent grazing. It does, Josephine agreed. My husband and I came here for the same reason. Her voice caught slightly. Thomas had big dreams for our ranch. Jackson's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry for your loss, madam, she nodded, blinking back tears. Thank you, it's been difficult. They fell into silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the baby. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in gold and crimson, Josephine found herself oddly at peace despite the day's trauma. There was something comforting about Jackson's steady presence. "Do you have a place to stay in town?" he asked eventually. "Yes, we have a small cabin just outside Castle Dome," she replied. "Nothing grand, but it's mine and Benjamin's now." She hesitated. "Thomas left some debts, though. I'm not sure how long I can keep it." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "If you don't mind my asking, how have you been managing?" "I've been taking in washing and mending," Josephine said, a hint of pride in her voice. "And I sell eggs from our chickens. It's not much, but we've been getting by." Until today, when her desperation to finish the washing had nearly cost them everything. As if reading her thoughts, Jackson said gently, "What happened at the river?" Josephine sighed. "Foolishness. I needed to wash Benjamin's things, and I thought the inlet would be safe. I didn't realize how strong the current was or how unstable the bank." She looked down at her sleeping son. "I nearly killed us both." "The river's treacherous this time of year," Jackson said, his tone free of judgment. "Even experienced men have been caught by surprise." His kindness brought fresh tears to her eyes, and she brushed them away quickly. "Will you be in the area long?" "A few weeks at least. There's a parcel north of town I'm particularly interested in, but the owner's driving a hard bargain." He smiled slightly. "I'm a patient man, though." Josephine found herself returning his smile. "Castle Dome could use more good men," she said, then blushed at her own forwardness. Jackson seemed not to notice her discomfort. "Your clothes should be dry by morning," he said, changing the subject. "We can head to your place first thing. I'm sure you'll be wanting to get the little one home." "Yes, thank you," she replied, grateful for his consideration. As night fell completely, Jackson insisted Josephine take the tent while he slept by the fire. Too exhausted to argue, she curled up in his bedroll with Benjamin nestled beside her. Despite the day's terror, or perhaps because of the pure relief that followed their rescue, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the smell of bacon frying and the soft gurgle of Benjamin, who was awake but content. Sunlight filtered through the canvas, suggesting it was well into morning. Josephine sat up quickly, surprised she had slept so long. She checked Benjamin, relieved to find him warm and apparently none the worse for their adventure. Her clothes, now dry if somewhat wrinkled, were folded neatly at the foot of the bedroll. She dressed quickly, grateful to be back in her own garments despite their simplicity. When she emerged from the tent, Jackson was crouched by the fire, turning bacon in a small skillet. He looked up at her approach, a smile warming his weathered face. "Morning," he said. "Hope you're hungry." "Starving," she admitted, returning his smile. "I can't remember when I last ate." "Well, it's nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up," he said, serving her a plate of bacon and pan bread. "How's the little fellow this morning?" "Surprisingly well," Josephine replied, shifting Benjamin in her arms. "Babies are more resilient than we give them credit for, I think." Jackson nodded, watching as she balanced the baby and tried to eat one-handed. "Would you like me to hold him while you eat?" he offered. Josephine hesitated. Benjamin was normally wary of strangers, and she seldom let him out of her arms, but there was something trustworthy about Jackson Turner. After all, he had risked his own life to save them. "If you wouldn't mind," she said, carefully transferring Benjamin to his arms. Jackson cradled the baby with unexpected skill. "Hey there, partner," he said softly, his big hand supporting Benjamin's head gently. "You gave your mama quite a scare yesterday." To Josephine's surprise, Benjamin didn't cry. Instead, he stared up at Jackson with solemn eyes before breaking into a toothless smile. "Well, look at that," Jackson said, clearly delighted. "I think he likes me." "He has good judgment," Josephine said without thinking, then blushed again. Jackson's smile deepened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. High praise indeed. They lingered over breakfast, chatting easily. Jackson told her about his years as a drover, moving cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas, and later through the southwestern territories. Josephine shared stories of growing up in St. Louis, where her father had been a shopkeeper, and how she'd met Thomas when he came to buy supplies before heading west. "He painted such a picture of Arizona," she said, a wistful note in her voice. "Wide open spaces, land for the taking, a place where a man could make something of himself." "It is that," Jackson agreed, "though not without its challenges." Josephine nodded, thinking of the harsh summers, the scarce water, the isolation, and now being alone with a baby and a struggling ranch. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm learning that." After breakfast, they broke camp efficiently. Jackson refused Josephine's offer to help, insisting she rest with Benjamin while he packed up. Within an hour, they were mounted on Chief, with Jackson's gear loaded onto the gray mare who followed behind on a lead rope. The ride to Josephine's cabin took less than 2 hours. It was a modest structure nestled against a rocky hillside, with a small corral containing a mule and a chicken coop from which several hens clucked and scratched. A vegetable garden, carefully fenced against rabbits, grew beside the cabin, and a barn that had seen better days stood nearby. "It's not much," Josephine said as they approached, suddenly conscious of the property's run-down appearance. "It's a good start," Jackson said approvingly. "Solid location, good water source." He nodded toward the well near the cabin. Thomas had a good eye. His words warmed her. It was true Thomas had selected the site carefully, with an eye for both practicality and beauty. From the cabin's single window, one could see the distant mountains painted in shades of purple and blue. Jackson helped her dismount and carried Benjamin to the cabin door. Josephine was acutely aware that they would soon part ways, this man who had saved their lives and shown them such kindness. The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" she offered, not ready to say goodbye just yet. "It's the least I can offer after everything you've done." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "That would be nice, thank you." The interior of the cabin was simple but neat. A table with 2 chairs occupied one corner, a cast-iron stove another. A curtain separated the main room from a small sleeping area, where a narrow bed and a handmade cradle were visible. A few books sat on a crude shelf, alongside a framed daguerreotype of Josephine and Thomas on their wedding day. Josephine busied herself with the stove, setting water to boil for coffee while Jackson settled in one of the chairs, still holding Benjamin. The baby had taken a surprising shine to the cowboy, grabbing at his beard with curious fingers. "You're good with him," Josephine observed as she measured coffee into a pot. "Had some practice with my sister's kids," Jackson explained. "5 of them now back in Texas. You must miss them." "I do," he admitted. "But the trail's no life for settling down. That's why I'm looking to buy land here. Time to put down roots." Josephine set a cup of coffee before him, then gently took Benjamin back. The baby fussed briefly before settling against her shoulder. "I should be going," Jackson said after finishing his coffee. "Got a meeting with that landowner this afternoon." "Of course," Josephine said, walking him to the door. At the threshold she paused. Mr. Turner Jackson, I don't know how I can ever repay you. He shook his head. There's nothing to repay, I'm just glad I was there. So am I, she said softly. Truly. Jackson settled his hat more firmly on his head. Would it be all right if I stopped by in a few days, just to check that you and the little one are doing all right? Relief and something else, something warmer flickered in Josephine's chest. We'd like that very much. With a tip of his hat, Jackson mounted Chief and rode away. Josephine stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared from sight, Benjamin cooing softly in her arms. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a flicker of hope for the future. True to his word, Jackson returned 3 days later. Josephine was in the garden when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt a smile spread across her face as she recognized the rider. Jackson dismounted, looking pleased to see her. Mrs. Zimmerman, he greeted her, removing his hat. How are you and the little one faring? Much better, thank you, she replied, dusting soil from her hands. And please call me Josephine. Josephine, he repeated, his smile deepening. He produced a small package from his saddlebag. I brought something for Benjamin. Inside was a tiny wooden horse, beautifully carved. Did you make this? Josephine asked, running her finger over the smooth surface. Jackson nodded, looking almost shy. Whittling helps pass the time on the trail. It's wonderful, she said sincerely. Come inside. Benjamin will be waking from his nap soon. Over coffee, Jackson shared news of his land negotiations. I think we're close to an agreement, he said. The parcel is just a few miles north of here. Good grazing land with a year-round spring. That sounds promising, Josephine said, genuinely pleased for him. They were interrupted by Benjamin's cries from the sleeping area. Josephine brought him out, freshly changed and hungry. Without self-consciousness, she settled in a chair to nurse him, draping a light blanket over her shoulder for modesty. If Jackson was uncomfortable, he didn't show it. He spoke of his plans for the ranch, the cattle he would bring in, the improvements he'd make to the land. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Josephine found herself offering suggestions based on her and Thomas's experiences. You know a lot about ranching, Jackson observed. I've had to learn, she replied. After Thomas died, there was no one else to manage things. Jackson's expression grew thoughtful. It's a lot for one person, especially with a baby. Yes, Josephine admitted, but we're managing. She didn't mention the mounting debts, or the fact that the mule was getting too old for plowing, or that the roof leaked when it rained. Pride kept those worries locked inside. After Benjamin finished nursing and was settled contentedly in her arms, Jackson surprised her with a question. Would you show me around your place? I'd like to see what Thomas was building here. Touched by his interest, Josephine agreed. With Benjamin secured in a sling across her chest, she led Jackson around the small ranch. She showed him the chicken coop Thomas had built, the garden she'd expanded, the fruit trees they'd planted that were just beginning to bear. When they reached the barn, Jackson examined the structure with a professional eye. Roof needs work, he commented, and this support beam is weakening. Josephine sighed. I know, Thomas was planning to reinforce it this spring. Jackson ran a hand along the weathered wood. I could help with that, he offered casually. Wouldn't take much to shore it up. I couldn't ask you to do that, Josephine protested. You didn't ask, I offered. His blue eyes held hers steadily. I'm good with my hands, and it would give me something to do while I wait for this land deal to close. Josephine wanted to refuse out of pride, but practicality won out. The barn was essential for storing hay for the mule and providing shelter during the rare but violent storms that swept through the area. If you're sure, she said finally, I would be very grateful. It's settled then, Jackson said, satisfaction in his voice. I'll bring some tools tomorrow. And so began a pattern that would continue over the coming weeks. Jackson would arrive early in the morning, work on the barn or other repairs around the property, and stay for a meal before returning to town. Sometimes he brought supplies, a sack of coffee, some sugar, a length of sturdy fabric that Josephine could use for Benjamin's growing needs. She protested his generosity at first, but Jackson waved away her concerns. "Consider it payment for the meals," he said. "Best cooking I've had in years." Josephine knew it was more than that he was helping because he saw their need and had the means to address it, but she accepted gracefully. In return, she mended his shirts, packed him lunches to take on his land surveying expeditions, and welcomed his company in the evenings when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. Benjamin thrived under the additional attention, growing plumper and more alert. He would light up whenever Jackson entered the cabin, reaching for him with eager hands. For his part, Jackson seemed equally enchanted with the baby, bringing him small carved animals to add to the horse, singing him old trail songs in a surprisingly melodious baritone. One evening in late May, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset, Jackson shared news. "The land deal is done," he said. "I sign the final papers tomorrow." "That's wonderful," Josephine said, ignoring the pang his words caused. With his own ranch to establish, he would have little time for visits to her cabin. She would miss his presence more than she cared to admit. "When will you start building?" "Right away," he replied. "Got to have shelter before winter." He glanced at her sideways. "Actually, I was hoping you might help me with the planning. You've got a good eye for what makes a home comfortable." Flattered by his request, Josephine agreed readily. "I'd be happy to." They fell silent, watching as the sun slipped behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Benjamin slept peacefully in Josephine's arms, his tiny face relaxed in slumber. "I've been thinking," Jackson said suddenly, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "About you and Benjamin." Josephine turned to look at him, something in his tone catching her attention. "Oh," Jackson shifted, seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband, and I don't want to presume, but I've grown very fond of both of you." Josephine's heart quickened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "The thing is," he went on, "starting a ranch alone is hard work, and you're struggling here on your own." He took a deep breath. "What if we combined our efforts? My land and capital, your experience and determination." Josephine blinked, unsure if she was understanding him correctly. "What exactly are you proposing, Jackson?" He met her eyes directly. "A partnership of sorts, to start with anyway. I have the means to build a proper ranch, and you know how to make it a home. Benjamin would have room to grow, and you wouldn't have to worry about making ends meet." "And what would I bring to this partnership?" Josephine asked carefully. "Your knowledge, your hard work." He hesitated. "Your company." A flush crept up his neck, visible even in the fading light. "I've grown accustomed to having you and Benjamin around. The thought of living alone on that new place, it doesn't hold the appeal it once did." Josephine's pulse raced. Was he suggesting what she thought he was? "Jackson, are you asking me to marry you?" He nodded slowly. "I am. Not very romantically, I'm afraid, but with sincerity." He reached out to take her free hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I know it's sudden. I know you're still grieving Thomas. But I think we could build something good together, Josephine. For us and for Benjamin." Josephine looked down at their joined hands, her thoughts in turmoil. She had cared deeply for Thomas, had mourned him sincerely. But the weeks since meeting Jackson had awakened feelings she hadn't expected to experience again: comfort in his presence, joy in his smile, a flutter in her stomach when their hands accidentally touched, And there were practical considerations, too. The ranch was failing slowly but surely. Without help, she would eventually have to sell, perhaps return east to her family in disgrace. Benjamin deserved better than that. But marriage, to a man she'd known only a few months, "I need time to think," she said finally. "It's not that I don't care for you, Jackson. I do very much. But marriage is a serious step." "Of course," he said immediately, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Take all the time you need. My offer stands, whatever you decide." He left soon after, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. Josephine barely slept that night, turning his proposal over in her mind. By morning, she was no closer to a decision. The days that followed were awkward, with Jackson keeping a respectful distance while continuing to help with repairs around the property. He didn't mention his proposal again, but Josephine caught him watching her sometimes with a wistful expression that made her heart ache. A week after his proposal, disaster struck. Josephine was hanging laundry when she smelled smoke. She turned to see flames licking at the roof of the barn, which had been baking in the summer sun for days. Without thinking, she ran toward it, remembering too late that she'd left Benjamin napping in his cradle inside the cabin. Torn between the fire and her baby, Josephine froze momentarily before racing back to the cabin. Benjamin was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger. She scooped him up and ran outside, placing him in a shaded spot well away from the barn before dashing to the well for water. But the fire was spreading quickly, consuming the dry wood with voracious hunger. Josephine worked frantically, hauling buckets from the well to throw on the flames, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. The heat was intense, forcing her back, and smoke stung her eyes and throat. She was about to give up when she heard hoofbeats. Jackson galloped into the yard, taking in the situation at a glance. He leapt from his horse and ran to her side. "Are you and Benjamin all right?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders. "Yes, he's safe," she gasped, coughing from the smoke. "But the barn, forget the barn," Jackson said firmly. "It's too far gone. We need to protect the cabin." Working together, they managed to keep the fire from spreading to the cabin, though they couldn't save the barn. By the time the flames died down, only charred timbers remained of the structure Thomas had built with such care. The hay stored inside was gone, along with the tools and supplies that had represented much of Josephine's remaining capital. Exhausted and soot-stained, Josephine sank to the ground beside Benjamin, who had miraculously slept through much of the excitement. Tears streaked her blackened face. "Everything Thomas worked for," she whispered. "It's all slipping away." Jackson knelt beside her, his own face grimy with smoke and sweat. "Not everything," he said gently. "You and Benjamin are safe. The cabin still stands. You haven't lost everything, Josephine." She looked up at him, seeing the concern in his eyes, the genuine care. In that moment, she knew her answer to his proposal. "Yes," she said simply. Jackson blinked, momentarily confused. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." She reached for his hand. "If the offer still stands." A slow smile spread across his face, brighter than the fire had been. "It stands," he assured her. "It will always stand." He leaned forward to press a gentle, tentative kiss to her forehead. "We'll build something new together, Josephine, something stronger than what was lost." And in that moment, surrounded by the remains of one dream, Josephine believed that a new one was just beginning. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Castle Dome. Josephine wore her best dress, freshly washed and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair. Jackson had a new shirt and his boots polished to a shine. Benjamin, dressed in a gown Josephine had sewn from the fabric Jackson brought, observed the proceedings with solemn eyes before breaking into a gurgle of delight when the preacher pronounced them man and wife. There were few witnesses, the storekeeper and his wife. A couple of ranchers Jackson had befriended during his land negotiations, and the blacksmith who had taken a liking to the quiet, determined widow and her baby. After the ceremony, they shared a simple meal at the town's only restaurant, with Benjamin passed from arm to arm, charming everyone with his smiles. As the afternoon waned, Jackson helped Josephine into the wagon he'd purchased for their new life. Their few belongings were packed behind them: Josephine's clothing and kitchenware, Benjamin's cradle, the books that had been her solace during lonely evenings, and the daguerreotype of Thomas that Jackson had insisted she bring. "He'll always be Benjamin's father," he'd said. "We won't try to erase him." His sensitivity had touched her deeply, confirming that she'd made the right decision in accepting his proposal. The ride to their new home took nearly 2 hours. As they crested a hill, Jackson reined in the horses and gestured to the valley below. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Turner Ranch." Josephine took in the scene with widening eyes. A small cabin stood near a copse of trees, smoke rising from its chimney. A corral held several horses, and the framework of a barn was already taking shape nearby. The land stretched out around it, grassland interspersed with desert plants, a stream winding through the property like a silver ribbon. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But how? When did you have time to build the cabin?" Jackson smiled somewhat sheepishly. "I hired some men from town to help while I was working on your barn. Wanted to have a proper place to bring you if you said yes." He glanced at her. "Do you like it?" "It's perfect," she assured him, her heart full. Even Benjamin seemed to approve, cooing happily from his place in her lap. As they drew closer, Josephine noticed a figure on the cabin's porch, a woman in a calico dress, waving to them. "Who's that?" she asked, surprised. "Mrs. Hattie Wilson," Jackson replied. "Widow from town who needed work. I hired her to help get the place ready and to lend a hand with Benjamin when needed. Thought you might appreciate another woman around, at least until you get settled." Tears pricked Josephine's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching to squeeze his hand. Their arrival at the cabin was a flurry of activity. Mrs. Wilson, a cheerful woman in her 50s, had prepared a special dinner for their first night as a family. The cabin, though simple, was clean and well appointed, with a proper stove, a sturdy table and chairs, and a separate bedroom with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt. "Made it myself," Mrs. Wilson said proudly when she saw Josephine admiring the handiwork. "Every bride needs a wedding quilt." After dinner, Mrs. Wilson discreetly retired to the small lean-to at the back of the cabin that Jackson had built for her, leaving the newlyweds alone with Benjamin. An awkward silence fell as they realized they were truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. "I'll just put Benjamin down," Josephine said, grateful for the distraction. Jackson had built a proper crib, larger than the cradle Benjamin had outgrown, and placed it in a corner of the bedroom. She laid the drowsy baby in it, humming softly until his eyes closed in sleep. When she turned, Jackson was standing in the doorway watching them with a tender expression. "He goes down easy," he observed. "Usually," Josephine agreed, "though he has his nights." Another silence fell, heavier this time. Jackson cleared his throat. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I don't expect. That is, I understand if you need time, before we truly become husband and wife in all ways." Josephine felt a blush warm her cheeks, but also a surge of affection for this man who continuously put her comfort above his own desires. She crossed the room to stand before him, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Jackson," she said softly, "I married you because I care for you, because I believe we can build a good life together. I don't want to begin that life with walls between us." Relief and something darker, more intense, flashed in his eyes. He reached up to cup her face gently. "Are you sure?" In answer, Josephine rose on tiptoes to press her lips to his. It was a tentative kiss at first, but it quickly deepened as Jackson's arms came around her, drawing her close against his solid chest. Warmth bloomed in her belly, spreading through her limbs as the kiss continued. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing quickly. Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you from the river," he admitted. Josephine laughed softly. "Even when I was dripping wet and half drowned, even then," he confirmed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, holding your baby above the water even when your own strength was failing." His words touched her deeply. No one had ever called her brave before. Thomas had valued her for her gentleness, her domesticity. But Jackson saw something else in her, a strength she hadn't recognized in herself, until circumstances forced it to the surface. That night, as they came together as husband and wife, Josephine discovered new dimensions to both herself and Jackson. His strength was matched by tenderness, his passion by patience, and her own body, which she had thought permanently marked by grief and motherhood, awakened to joy once more. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms with the moonlight streaming through the cabin window, Josephine felt a peace she hadn't known in months. Benjamin slept soundly in his crib, and beyond the cabin walls, their land waited for the care and attention that would transform it into a true home. "Happy," Jackson murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Yes," Josephine replied truthfully. "Are you?" His arms tightened around her. "More than I ever thought possible." The days that followed settled into a rhythm of work and domesticity. Jackson continued building the barn with the help of hired men from town, while Josephine established her household with Mrs. Wilson's assistance. She planted a vegetable garden, set up a chicken coop, and learned the rhythms of the land that was now her home. Benjamin thrived in the open air, growing sturdy and adventurous. By the time summer gave way to autumn, he was crawling, exploring the cabin and the yard with insatiable curiosity. Jackson delighted in his development, carving new toys for him and spending evenings on the porch with Benjamin on his lap, pointing out stars and telling stories of his cattle-driving days. Watching them together, Josephine sometimes felt a pang of regret that Thomas had not lived to see his son grow. But these moments were increasingly overshadowed by gratitude for Jackson's presence in their lives. He was everything she could have wished for in a husband: kind, hardworking, devoted to both her and Benjamin. And she had come to love him, deeply and without reservation. It had happened gradually, built on a foundation of respect and shared purpose, but no less powerful for its quiet growth. Sometimes, she caught him looking at her with an expression that suggested he felt the same, though neither had spoken the words aloud. As winter approached, the barn was completed, a sturdy structure that would shelter their growing herd of cattle through the cold months. Jackson had purchased a small herd as the foundation for their ranch, and he spent long days riding the boundaries of their property, learning its contours and planning for spring grazing. Mrs. Wilson had returned to town when the weather turned, promising to visit in the spring. Josephine found she didn't mind the solitude of their remote ranch as much as she'd feared. The cabin was snug, her days full of purposeful work, and her nights warm with Jackson's presence. One evening in early December, as they sat before the fire after Benjamin had been put to bed, Jackson surprised her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Josephine asked, accepting it with curiosity. "Open it and see," he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny portrait of Benjamin on one side, his chubby face captured with remarkable detail. "How did you?" "Photographer came through Castle Dome last month when I was in town for supplies," Jackson explained. "I had him make a special miniature from the portrait we took." Josephine remembered the day Jackson had insisted they all dress in their best clothes and ride into town for a family portrait, their first. The result had been displayed proudly on their mantel since. "It's beautiful," she said, blinking back tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. "But what's the occasion?" Jackson took her hand, his expression growing serious. "I wanted to mark the day. It's been 6 months since I pulled you and Benjamin from the river. 6 months that changed my life in ways I never imagined." Josephine squeezed his hand, moved by his sentimentality. "Changed mine, too." Jackson hesitated, then continued, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, something I should have said before now." He met her eyes, his own filled with emotion. "I love you, Josephine, not just as my wife, not just as Benjamin's mother, but for yourself, for your strength, your kindness, your determination. I think I've loved you since that first day, watching you fight the river to keep your baby safe." Josephine felt tears spill onto her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much, Jackson." He pulled her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that still surprised her 6 months into their marriage. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "I have news too," Josephine said, suddenly shy. She took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "We're going to have another baby come summer." Jackson's eyes widened, then filled with such joy that Josephine's heart nearly burst. "A baby," he repeated, his voice hushed with wonder. "Our baby," Josephine nodded, laughing through her tears as Jackson whooped and lifted her from her chair, spinning her in a circle before setting her gently back on her feet. "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he assured her, dropping to his knees to press a reverent kiss to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one," he murmured. "Your mama and brother and I can't wait to meet you." Josephine stroked his hair, overwhelmed by the love she felt for this man who had saved not just her and Benjamin's lives, but her heart as well. The months that followed were busy ones. The ranch demanded constant attention as spring approached, with new calves being born and fences needing repair after winter storms. Jackson insisted that Josephine rest more as her pregnancy progressed, hiring a young woman from town to help with household chores, and Benjamin, who was now walking and talking in simple sentences. Josephine found that pregnancy agreed with her. Unlike her time carrying Benjamin, which had been marked by Thomas's increasing anxiety about the ranch and their finances, this pregnancy was a joyous time. Jackson treated her with gentle devotion, making sure she ate well and didn't overexert herself, while still respecting her desire to contribute to their growing ranch. Benjamin, now nearly 18 months old, regarded his mother's expanding waistline with curiosity. "Baby?" he would ask, patting her stomach. When the baby kicked, his eyes would widen in astonishment, prompting laughter from both Josephine and Jackson. As summer approached, bringing with it scorching heat, Josephine's time grew near. Jackson arranged for Mrs. Wilson to return, along with a midwife from Castle Dome who would stay with them until the baby arrived. "I'm not taking any chances," he told Josephine when she protested the expense. "Not with you and the little one." His concern touched her, especially knowing that he still woke sometimes from nightmares of finding her too late in the river, of losing her and Benjamin to the rushing water. Those dreams had grown less frequent over time, but the memory of that day had left its mark on all of them. The baby chose a sweltering day in late June to make its appearance. Josephine woke before dawn with the first pains, recognizing them from Benjamin's birth. She touched Jackson's shoulder gently, waking him. "It's time," she said simply. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort, but unlike Benjamin's birth, when she had labored alone while Thomas paced anxiously outside, this time she was surrounded by support. Mrs. Wilson and the midwife guided her skillfully, and Jackson refused to leave her side, holding her hand and wiping her brow as the contractions intensified. Just as the sun was setting, painting the bedroom in golden light, their daughter was born, a robust baby with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs. The midwife cleaned and swaddled her before placing her in Josephine's arms. "She's perfect," Josephine whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. "Look what we made, Jackson." Jackson's face, as he gazed down at his daughter, held such naked adoration that Josephine felt tears spring to her eyes once more. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother." They named her Elizabeth Rose Elizabeth for Jackson's mother, and Rose for the wild roses that had been blooming when Josephine accepted his proposal. Benjamin, brought in to meet his sister after things had been tidied up, regarded the tiny bundle with solemn interest. "Baby," he said decisively, reaching out a careful finger to touch her cheek. "My baby." "That's right," Jackson told him, lifting the boy onto the bed beside Josephine. "Your sister. You're a big brother now, Benjamin." The family portrait was complete: mother, father, son, and daughter, bonded by love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. As twilight deepened into night, Josephine looked around at her family and marveled at how life could change in the space of a year. From the depths of grief and the terror of that day in the river to this moment of pure contentment, it seemed almost miraculous. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked softly, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how close we came to never having this," she replied honestly. "If you hadn't been riding by the river that day." Jackson shook his head, taking her hand. "I don't believe that was chance," he said. "Some things are meant to be, Josephine. We were meant to find each other." And looking into his eyes, holding their daughter while Benjamin nestled against her side, Josephine knew he was right. Their love story had begun in danger and desperation, but it had grown into something strong and enduring, like the land they were cultivating together, like the family they were building, one day at a time. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and joys. Turner Ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding as they acquired additional land and increased their herd. Benjamin grew into a sturdy, thoughtful boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gentle nature. Elizabeth, or Ellie as they called her, was her father's shadow from the moment she could walk, following him around the ranch and soaking up his knowledge of horses and cattle. 2 more children joined their family: James, born 3 years after Ellie, and Sarah, who arrived 2 years after that. Their home expanded too, with Jackson adding rooms to the original cabin until it became a proper ranch house, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and large windows that let in the Arizona sunlight. Josephine never forgot that day in the river, the day that had nearly ended her life and Benjamin's, the day that had instead led her to Jackson and a happiness deeper than she had imagined possible. Each year on the anniversary, she and Jackson would ride to the spot on the Colorado where he had pulled her from the water. They would picnic on the bank, watching their children play in the shallows under careful supervision, and remember how their story began. On the 10th such anniversary, with Benjamin now almost 11, Ellie 9, James 6, and Sarah 4, they sat together on a blanket while the children splashed nearby. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked, watching her face. saying yes to me when we barely knew each other, taking a chance on a wandering cowboy who didn't have much to offer but dreams and hard work. Josephine smiled, leaning against his shoulder. At 32, she was still as beautiful to him as she had been at 22, perhaps more so for the wisdom and confidence the years had brought her. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment." Jackson put his arm around her, drawing her close. "Me neither," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made was riding along this river that day." They watched as Benjamin helped little Sarah examine a frog they'd found among the reeds. Ellie and James were constructing an elaborate dam of stones and sticks, arguing good-naturedly about its design. The river flowed peacefully beyond them, its power contained within its banks today, a far cry from the raging torrent it had been that April day so long ago. "I was so afraid," Josephine admitted quietly. "Not just of drowning, but of what would happen to Benjamin if I died. I had no family here, no close friends yet. He would have been alone." Jackson's arm tightened around her. "But you didn't give up," he said. "You kept fighting, kept his head above water even when your own strength was failing. That's when I knew you were someone special, Josephine Turner." She smiled at the name she'd carried now for a decade. "And when did you know you loved me?" she asked, though she'd heard the story before. It was a favorite tale among their children. "The moment you opened your eyes after I pulled you from the river," he said promptly. "You looked at me and then at Benjamin, and the relief in your face when you saw he was safe, it went straight to my heart. I thought, here's a woman who knows what matters, and then I was lost." Josephine laughed softly. "It took me a bit longer," she admitted, "but not much. That night in your camp when you held Benjamin so I could eat, I think that's when it started." "Started," Jackson teased, "just started. And here I thought my charm was irresistible." Josephine elbowed him playfully. "Well, it took more than charm to win me over, Cowboy. It took burned barn and a very practical proposal." "Not my most romantic moment," Jackson acknowledged with a grin, "but it worked out in the end." "It did indeed," Josephine agreed, watching as Benjamin now organized all the children in a game of tag along the shoreline. At nearly 11, he was showing signs of the man he would become, thoughtful like Thomas had been, but with Jackson's practicality and love of the land. He didn't remember Thomas, of course, but they had made sure he knew about his birth father, keeping the daguerreotype displayed in their home and telling him stories of the man who had first brought them to Arizona. "You think they'll remember this place these days, when they're grown?" Josephine asked, nodding toward their children. Jackson considered this. "Some of it, maybe. The feeling of it, at least. Family, security, love. That's what I hope they'll carry with them." "Me too," Josephine said softly. As the sun began to set, they called the children back to the blanket for the picnic Mrs. Wilson had packed for them. At 65, she still lived in the expanded lean-to behind their house, now a proper cottage, and was as much a part of their family as any blood relation. Over fried chicken and cornbread, apple pie and lemonade, they shared stories and laughter. When the meal was done, Jackson produced his harmonica and played tunes while the children danced on the riverbank, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. "Time to head back," Jackson announced finally, noticing Josephine trying to hide a yawn. "We've got an early start tomorrow with the cattle drive." The children helped pack up without complaint, tired from their day of play. On the ride home, Sarah fell asleep in Josephine's arms, while James nodded drowsily in the saddle in front of Jackson. Benjamin and Ellie rode their own horses, gifts from Jackson when they'd each turned 8. Back at the ranch house, they settled the children into bed with kisses and stories. When the house was finally quiet, Josephine and Jackson sat on the porch swing, enjoying the cool night air and the blanket of stars overhead. "Happy anniversary," Jackson said, raising the glass of whiskey he'd poured for them both. It was a tradition they'd established, this one night of the year when Josephine would join him in a small toast. "To the river," she replied, clinking her glass against his, "and to second chances." "To us," Jackson added, "and the next 10 years, and the 10 after that." Josephine sipped the fiery liquid, letting it warm her from the inside out. "I'll drink to that," she said, nestling closer to him on the swing. "Though I must be getting old, I'm exhausted." Jackson chuckled. "Running a ranch and raising 4 children will do that to a person," he observed. "Even one as remarkable as you." They finished their drinks in comfortable silence, rocking gently as the moon rose over their land. When Josephine's eyes began to close despite her best efforts, Jackson helped her to her feet. "Bed for you, Mrs. Turner," he said fondly. "Tomorrow's another day." "A good one, I expect," she replied, letting him guide her inside. "They usually are with you." And as they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Josephine thought again of that desperate day in the river, of the terror and exhaustion, and of the moment when strong hands had grabbed hers, and a steady voice had promised safety. From that moment had grown all of this: a home, a family, a love that had only deepened with each passing year. Life was like that river, she reflected as she prepared for bed. Powerful, unpredictable, capable of sweeping you away in an instant, but also capable of carrying you to places you'd never imagined, if you were brave enough to ride its current and lucky enough to find someone to hold onto when the waters ran high. As Jackson's arms encircled her in the darkness of their bedroom, Josephine sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the river that had nearly taken her life, but had instead given her everything she'd ever wanted, and more than she'd ever dared to dream.